Hope, Eleanor had learned, was a cruelty disguised as kindness, a poison wrapped in silk that slipped past one's defences only to shatter everything it touched. And as she lay in her narrow bed at Briarwood Manor, watching the grey morning light seep through curtains grown thin from too many washings, she understood this truth with the bone-deep certainty of one who had swallowed that poison and survived its bitter aftermath. Better to expect nothing than to be shattered by the loss of everything, she told herself, as she had told herself every morning for 3 years now, ever since that spring evening at the Hartwell Ball, when she had stood frozen behind a marble pillar, her heart turning to ash in her chest, while Theodore Blackwell's careless laughter drifted toward her like smoke from a fire she had not known was burning. The Ashworth girl, he had called her, a pleasant enough diversion while I waited for the Pemberton heiress to come of age, and even now, even after all this time, Eleanor's fingers drifted unconsciously to the hollow of her throat at the memory, pressing against the pulse that still beat despite everything, as if to reassure herself that she had not, in fact, died of shame that night. The chill of her bedchamber wrapped around her like an unwelcome companion, for fires were conserved at Briarwood now, lit only in the main rooms, and only when absolutely necessary, another quiet testament to the reduced circumstances that had made her such easy prey for a man like Theodore in the first place. She rose and dressed herself without ringing for the maid they could barely afford to keep, her movements practised and efficient, her reflection in the spotted mirror showing a young woman of 23, with rich chestnut waves she pinned into a modest chignon, grey-green eyes the colour of a winter sea, that had learned to guard their depths, and a small constellation of freckles across the bridge of her nose that she had once been foolish enough to worry Theodore might find unbecoming. The whispers had followed her for seasons afterward, rippling through ballrooms and drawing-rooms like stones cast into still water, and though they had eventually faded to mere murmurs, Eleanor knew that society never truly forgot, that somewhere in the collective memory of the ton she remained the penniless girl who had reached above her station and been publicly reminded of her place. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and her mother entered, Lady Margaret Ashworth's gentle face arranged in an expression Eleanor had come to recognize as carefully managed hope, the kind of hope that mothers clung to even when their daughters had long since abandoned it. "We have received an invitation," her mother said, her voice carrying that particular brightness that meant she knew Eleanor would not welcome the news, to the Hartwell House party next week. And Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, because of course it would be Hartwell. Of course she would be asked to return to the very place where her humiliation had been witnessed by half of fashionable society. And yet she saw in her mother's eyes the truth that neither of them would speak aloud. That her father's investments had failed, that her dowry was negligible, that her family needed her to make a match, however unlikely that prospect had become. And so she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin and said simply, "Then I shall pack my things," because Eleanor Ashworth had learned that survival required armor, and hers was forged from dignity and the absolute refusal to let anyone see her break. The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel drive of Hartwell House, with a sound that seemed to Eleanor like the grinding of fate's machinery, each rotation bringing her closer to the place where her heart had been so thoroughly dismantled 3 years before. And as the grand facade rose into view through the rain-spattered window, she felt her mother's gloved hand find hers, and squeeze with the kind of wordless reassurance that only deepened the ache in her chest, because Lady Margaret still believed, still hoped, still imagined that something good might come of this return to the scene of her daughter's greatest shame. The house itself was magnificent, all golden stone and tall windows that caught the pale afternoon light, surrounded by manicured gardens that spoke of wealth so effortless it need never announce itself, and Eleanor straightened her spine and lifted her chin as the footman opened the door, because she would not arrive at Hartwell House looking like a woman who expected to be pitied. The entrance hall swallowed them in marble and candlelight, and almost immediately Eleanor felt the weight of watching eyes, the subtle turn of heads, the whispers that fluttered behind fans like moths against glass. And she knew with sickening certainty that society had not forgotten, that her presence here was already being noted and discussed and dissected by those who had nothing better to do than feast upon the misfortunes of others. Her father, Lord Charles Ashworth, walked beside her, with his shoulders set in that posture of quiet dignity he had worn like armour ever since his trusted adviser's investments had crumbled to dust, and Eleanor loved him fiercely for the way he refused to bow his head, even as their circumstances demanded they accept invitations they would once have been too proud to need. She saw Theodore before she was ready, glimpsed him across the drawing-room, with his golden hair catching the light, and his blue eyes fixed upon a woman who must be his wife, Harriet, whose expression suggested she had swallowed something bitter and could not rid herself of the taste, and Eleanor forced her gaze away so quickly that her neck ached with the violence of it, her fingers flying to the hollow of her throat in that gesture she could never quite suppress. The room felt suddenly airless, the press of bodies and the heat of too many candles and the suffocating weight of memory driving her toward the terrace doors with steps she hoped appeared leisurely rather than desperate, and when she finally emerged into the cool afternoon air she drew a breath so deep it bordered on improper, her eyes closing briefly against the relief of escape. She was not alone, she realized a moment later, her eyes opening to discover a tall figure standing at the far end of the terrace, a man whose broad shoulders were turned toward the gardens, as if he found the company of hedgerows preferable to that of the guests inside. And even before she saw his face, Eleanor knew him by reputation alone. For there was only one man in England who stood with such forbidding stillness, who wore solitude like a cloak, who was whispered about in drawing-rooms as the Duke of Ashford, cold and proud and impossible to please. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she caught a hint of something unexpected as she passed, sandalwood and cedar with an undertone of leather, a scent so distinctly masculine that it seemed to belong to the wilderness rather than the ballroom. And then his dark eyes met hers, and he spoke just 2 words in a voice far deeper than she had anticipated. "Miss Ashworth," a simple acknowledgment that somehow managed to convey neither warmth nor disdain, but merely recognition, as if he had catalogued her existence and found it unremarkable. Eleanor murmured a courtesy and retreated to the opposite end of the terrace, her heart beating strangely fast for reasons she refused to examine, and she watched from the corner of her eye as a determined matron in puce silk approached him with her daughter in tow, watched his jaw tighten visibly before he excused himself with a precision so cold it could have frozen the Thames, and she thought that here at last was someone who understood what it meant to build walls, though his were constructed of ice, where hers were made of quiet dignity. Throughout the afternoon she found herself aware of him in a way that unsettled her, noting how guests parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, how even the most ambitious mothers hesitated before approaching, how he stood always slightly apart, as if ordinary society could not quite contain him, and once, just once, she looked up from a conversation with a distant cousin to find his dark eyes resting upon her with an expression she could not read, and she looked away so quickly that she nearly upset her teacup, telling herself firmly that she had imagined his interest, that a man like the Duke of Ashford would have no reason to notice a woman like her, that hope was a cruelty she had long since learned to refuse. The library at Hartwell House smelled of leather and old paper, and the particular kind of dust that accumulates only in rooms where books are collected but seldom read, and Eleanor breathed it in like a drowning woman finally breaking the surface, grateful beyond measure to have escaped the drawing-room where Lady Pemberton had been holding court on the subject of advantageous marriages, with pointed glances in Eleanor's direction that suggested she remembered precisely how disadvantageous certain connections could prove. She had not expected to find the room occupied, had imagined herself alone among the shelves, with nothing but the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light for company. And so, when she rounded the corner and discovered the Duke of Ashford seated in a leather chair by the window, with a volume open upon his knee, she stopped so abruptly that her skirts swayed with the arrested momentum, her hand flying to her throat before she could prevent it. He looked up at her intrusion, those dark eyes that had seemed so impenetrable yesterday, now merely watchful, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a held breath, until Eleanor began to murmur an apology and retreat. But before she could complete her withdrawal, he surprised her utterly by asking, in that deep voice she remembered from the terrace, "What book do you seek, Miss Ashworth?" And she found herself answering honestly, rather than offering the polite deflection she had prepared. "I confess I sought only escape, Your Grace, though I had hoped to find Shakespeare if the library possessed him." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name, and he gestured toward a shelf near the fireplace with a movement that seemed almost reluctant, as if he were unused to extending even this small courtesy, and said, "Third shelf, beside the window," and Eleanor thanked him and went to retrieve the volume, acutely aware of his gaze upon her back as she ran her fingers along the spines until she found what she sought. "You prefer Shakespeare to the modern novels the other ladies favour," he observed when she turned, and it was not quite a question, but neither was it a dismissal. And Eleanor heard herself reply with more candour than wisdom, "I prefer honesty to pretence, Your Grace." Shakespeare understood that, and she watched his jaw tighten in that way she had observed yesterday, though this time she thought she detected something almost like approval in the gesture. They spoke then, haltingly at first, of poetry and plays, and the particular satisfaction of words that meant precisely what they said, and Eleanor discovered that when the Duke of Ashford forgot to be forbidding, he was unexpectedly well read, his observations sharp, and his preferences surprisingly similar to her own, and she lost track of time entirely, until the clock upon the mantel chimed the hour, and she realized she had been absent from the company far longer than propriety allowed. She excused herself and made her way toward the door, the Shakespeare volume clutched to her chest like a shield, and she had nearly reached the hallway when a familiar figure stepped into her path, golden hair gleaming and blue eyes cold with a malice that had once been hidden beneath. Charm, and Theodore Blackwell smiled at her with the particular cruelty of a man who knows his victim cannot escape. "Still hoping to catch a husband above your station," he murmured, soft enough that only she could hear. "One would think you would have learned your lesson by now." And Eleanor felt the old shame rise in her throat like bile, her fingers pressing hard against the hollow of her neck. But before she could summon a response, she became aware of a presence behind her, solid and immovable as stone, and she watched Theodore's face drain of colour as his gaze fixed upon something over her shoulder. "Ashford," Theodore managed, his voice stripped of its silken menace. "I was merely—" But he did not finish, could not finish, because the Duke said nothing at all, merely stood there with an expression so coldly dangerous that Theodore muttered something about being expected elsewhere, and retreated down the corridor with steps that were not quite running but desperately wished to be. The Duke still said nothing as he moved to Eleanor's side, offered his arm with a gesture that suggested escorting her to the drawing-room was simply the natural order of things, and as they walked she noticed that his hand hovered near her elbow, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve, protective without presumption, and she wondered for the first time if the walls he built were not so different from her own, and what manner of wounds might lie hidden behind them. 2 days had passed since the encounter in the library corridor, 2 days during which Eleanor had felt the Duke's presence like a distant storm on the horizon, always aware of where he stood in a room even when she did not look at him, always conscious of the way conversations seemed to quiet when he approached. And so when a footman appeared at her elbow during the afternoon's garden party to inform her that His Grace the Duke of Ashford requested a private audience in the rose garden, She felt her heart stutter in a manner that was entirely inappropriate for a woman who had sworn off hope. Her mother's eyes brightened with a speculation Eleanor could not bear to examine, and the whispers that followed her as she made her way through the manicured hedgerows felt like fingers plucking at her sleeve. But she kept her chin lifted and her pace measured, because she would not give society the satisfaction of seeing her hurry toward what was surely nothing more than a continuation of their literary discussion, or perhaps a warning about Theodore's malicious intentions. The rose garden at twilight was a study in shadows and scent, the last golden light of evening catching the edges of petals in shades of cream and blush and deepest crimson. And she found him standing beside a stone bench in an alcove half hidden by climbing roses, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky, in a way that made her breath catch despite her best intentions. "Miss Ashworth," he said, as she approached, and his voice was formal, clipped, the voice of a man conducting business rather than pleasure, and she steeled herself for whatever polite rejection or well-meaning advice he intended to deliver. But what came next shattered every expectation she had carefully constructed. "I find myself in need of a wife," he said without preamble, his dark eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her bones. "And I believe we might suit one another admirably." And for a moment Eleanor was certain she had misheard him, certain that the scent of roses and the strange magic of twilight had conjured words that could not possibly have been spoken. He continued before she could find her voice, speaking of practicality and partnership, of her wit that had impressed him, and her dignity in difficult circumstances that had earned his respect, of mutual advantage and compatible temperaments, and the benefits of an arrangement between two intelligent adults who expected nothing so foolish as romance. And Eleanor listened with her heart pounding so loudly she was amazed he could not hear it, her fingers pressed hard against the hollow of her throat, as if she could physically hold herself together. He did not speak of love, did not pretend to feelings he did not possess, and somehow this honesty was more affecting than any flowery declaration could have been, because Theodore had spoken of love and meant nothing by it, but this man spoke of respect, and she believed every word. The scent of sandalwood and cedar reached her as he stepped closer, stronger now than it had been on the terrace, and she found herself looking up into eyes that had warmed almost imperceptibly from black to something approaching amber, as he waited for her response, with a tension visible in the tightening of his jaw. "I must ask for time to consider," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, and he nodded once, curtly, as if he had anticipated nothing less. "Of course," he said, and then, as he turned to leave, he paused and spoke the words that would echo through all the days to come. "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth. I will never give you cause to regret this arrangement. You will want for nothing." And Eleanor watched him walk away through the deepening twilight, her hand still pressed to her throat, her mind reeling with the impossible weight of what had just occurred. And somewhere beneath the shock and the disbelief she felt the first dangerous stirring of something she had sworn never to feel again, though she told herself firmly that she would not hope for more than what he offered, that contentment would be enough, that it must be enough. The morning of Eleanor's departure from Briarwood Manor dawned grey and soft with the promise of rain, and she stood in the entrance hall amid trunks that contained everything she owned in the world, which was not very much, and watched her mother's face as Lady Margaret Ashworth fought to maintain the composure that had been her gift to her daughter, the quiet dignity that bent but never broke. Her father had already embraced her twice, and now stood by the window with his back turned, his shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly in a way that made Eleanor's throat ache with love for this gentle man who had given her everything he could and blamed himself for what he could not, and when he finally turned his eyes were bright with unshed tears that he did not attempt to hide. "You will write to us," he said, and it was not a question but a plea, and Eleanor promised that she would visit, promised all the things daughters promise when they leave the homes of their childhood for the unknown territories of marriage. And then her mother took her hands and drew her close, and whispered against her hair the words that Eleanor would carry with her like a talisman through all the uncertain days ahead. My darling girl, the right man will not need to be convinced of your value. He will simply see it as clearly as he sees the sun. And Eleanor held those words close to her heart as the carriage pulled away, and Briarwood Manor grew smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely behind a curve in the road. The journey to Ashford Hall took the better part of the day, and with each mile Eleanor felt the weight of her new life pressing more heavily upon her chest, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment when the carriage crested the final hill and the estate spread before her in all its impossible grandeur. The great house rising from manicured grounds like something from a fever dream, its pale stone facade stretching wider than seemed possible, its windows catching the late afternoon light like dozens of watching eyes. The carriage wheels crunched against gravel that seemed to announce her arrival to the entire county, and when she stepped down onto the drive, her footsteps echoed against marble as she entered a hall so vast that her family's entire home might have fit within it, and she had to fight the urge to press her hand to her throat, choosing instead to square her shoulders and lift her chin, because she was the Duchess of Ashford now, and she would meet this challenge with the dignity her mother had taught her. The Duke greeted her with formal courtesy, his dark eyes unreadable as he introduced her to Mrs. Thornton, a silver-haired woman whose sharp gaze missed nothing, and then he excused himself for estate business, with a bow that was perfectly correct and utterly distant, leaving Eleanor to be settled by the housekeeper, whose politeness carried an unmistakable note of assessment. Eleanor followed Mrs. Thornton through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and rooms furnished with treasures that cost more than her father earned in a decade, and she was examining a vase of hothouse flowers when she heard Mrs. Thornton's voice, drifting from an adjacent doorway, speaking to another servant in tones clearly not meant to be overheard. "Mark my words, that girl will either heal him or break him. There is no middle ground with a heart that has been frozen that long." And Eleanor stood very still, her fingers hovering above a white petal, and pretended she had heard nothing at all, though the words settled into her bones like a prophecy she was not yet certain she wished to fulfill. The first week of Eleanor's marriage passed in a strange twilight of formality and distance, her days filled with the learning of household routines and the memorization of servants' names and the careful navigation of corridors that still felt more like a museum than a home. And though she saw the Duke each evening at dinner, their conversations remained the polite exchanges of strangers who happened to share a table, discussions of weather and estate matters, and the quality of the cook's efforts that revealed nothing of the man behind the impenetrable mask of courtesy. And Eleanor found herself wondering in the quiet hours before sleep whether this careful distance was all her marriage would ever be, whether she had traded the uncertainty of her old life for a different kind of loneliness, one gilded with luxury but hollow at its core. She had taken to spending her evenings in the library, that magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and wisdom, and the particular dust of books that had been collected with love, and it was there that the storm found her on the 7th night, the sky having darkened with unnatural swiftness throughout the afternoon, until the first crack of thunder sent the household into a flurry of closing shutters and lighting additional candles, and Eleanor had curled into a chair by the fire with a volume of poetry, content to let the tempest rage beyond the windows, while she lost herself in verses that spoke of emotions she had forbidden herself to feel. She did not hear the door open over the fury of the storm, did not know she was no longer alone, until a flash of lightning illuminated the room, and she looked up to find the Duke standing just inside the doorway, rain still glistening on the shoulders of his coat, as though he had been caught outside when the heavens opened, and the sight of him there, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, and his usual rigid composure softened by surprise at finding her in his sanctuary, made her heart perform an entirely unwelcome leap. "A meeting with the land steward," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the storm-lashed windows, cancelled by the weather, and Eleanor nodded and made to rise, to offer him his privacy, but he held up a hand and said, "Please, do not leave on my account." And so she settled back into her chair while he moved to stand by the fire, and the silence between them stretched taut as a bowstring until a particularly violent crack of thunder made Eleanor gasp and start from her seat. And in that instant his hand was on her elbow, steadying her, and the touch burned through the fabric of her sleeve like a brand, spreading warmth up her arm and into her chest, until she could scarcely breathe for the intensity of it. Their eyes met and held, his dark gaze warming to amber in the firelight, and she watched his jaw tighten with some internal struggle before he released her almost abruptly and turned toward the rain-lashed windows, as if seeking escape from whatever had just passed between them. "You are not afraid of storms," he said, and it was not quite a question, and Eleanor found her voice somehow. "I find them clarifying, Your Grace. One cannot pretend calm when the world itself is in tumult." And something in his expression shifted, softened, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formal edge, and the hour that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Conversation flowing more easily as the storm raged on, and Eleanor felt the first fragile threads of connection weaving between them in that fire-lit room while the thunder rolled overhead. The invitation to accompany the Duke on his morning rounds came 3 days after the storm, delivered with the same careful formality that characterized all their interactions, and yet carrying beneath its surface something that felt almost like an offering. And Eleanor accepted with equal courtesy, while her heart beat a quiet rhythm of anticipation she refused to examine too closely. And so she found herself walking beside him through the estate grounds, on a morning washed clean by recent rains, the spring sunshine falling warm upon her shoulders as they made their way along paths that wound between fields where tenant farmers paused in their labours to touch their caps and murmur greetings that held respect, certainly, but also something that looked very much like wariness, the way one might greet a storm that had not yet decided whether to pass peacefully or unleash its fury. She observed him throughout the morning as he spoke with his tenants about drainage and crop rotation, and the repair of a fence that had fallen in the recent tempest, his manner brisk and efficient, his questions pointed, and his expectations clear. And she saw how the men straightened in his presence, and how their wives curtsied with downcast eyes. And she understood that while he was fair in his dealings and generous in his provisions, he was not loved, not exactly, for there was too much distance in him, too much of the cold Duke, and not enough of the man she had glimpsed in the firelit library. They came at last to a cottage, set back from the lane, smaller than the others, and wreathed in the scent of bread baking that drifted from its open door like a benediction, and the farmer's wife emerged to greet them with a daughter clinging to her skirts, a small thing of perhaps 6 years, with copper curls and wide eyes that grew wider still when they fell upon the Duke's imposing figure, and before anyone could speak, the child burst into tears, great heaving sobs that shook her tiny frame as she pressed her face against her mother's apron. Eleanor watched, expecting the Duke to step back, to allow the mother to soothe the child, to perhaps show irritation at this disruption to his schedule. But instead he did something that stopped her breath entirely, for he knelt, this proud and distant man, knelt right there in the dirt of the cottage yard, until his eyes were level with the child's, and when he spoke his voice was gentler than Eleanor had ever heard it. "There now," he said, "you must be Martha. I have heard you are very brave." And the child peeked at him through her tears, and he continued with a gravity that somehow held warmth within it. I am not so very frightening, am I? Only tall. It is a terrible inconvenience, I assure you. And then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small wrapped sweet, holding it out on his palm as one might offer a treat to a skittish foal. And the child's tears transformed into a tremulous smile as she reached for the gift. And Eleanor's hand moved without her permission to press against her heart, for she understood now that he carried those sweets deliberately, that he had done this before, that beneath the stern exterior beat a heart capable of such unexpected tenderness, and something within her shifted irrevocably, some wall she had built beginning to crumble. The evening of her first dinner party, as Duchess arrived with all the inevitability of a tide Eleanor could not hold back, and she stood before the mirror in her chambers while her maid arranged the final pins in her chignon, studying her own reflection, as if searching for some sign that she belonged in the sapphire silk gown that whispered against her skin with each breath, some evidence that she was truly the mistress of this great house, and not merely a pretender who would be exposed the moment she descended the stairs. And though she had memorized the menu and consulted with Mrs. Thornton on every detail of the table settings and rehearsed a dozen conversational gambits suitable for the occasion, her fingers still trembled slightly as she touched the hollow of her throat in that gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The guests arrived precisely at the appointed hour. Lord and Lady Hamilton with their practised smiles that did not quite reach their eyes, Sir Frederick and Lady Bentley, whose gazes swept over Eleanor with the barely concealed assessment of those cataloguing every detail to share later over tea with friends who had not been present, and Eleanor felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure as she greeted them in the drawing-room, acutely aware that these were people who had known of her reduced circumstances, who had perhaps whispered about the Duke's surprising choice of bride, who were even now searching for evidence that he had made a grave miscalculation. The Duke stood beside her as they received their guests, his presence a solid warmth at her shoulder that steadied her more than she wished to admit. And when they processed into the dining-room with its crystal that caught the candlelight like captured stars, and its silver that gleamed against the pristine white linens, Eleanor took her place at the foot of the table and lifted her chin with the quiet dignity her mother had always said was her greatest asset. The dinner progressed smoothly enough at first, conversation flowing around the excellence of the soup and the state of the roads and the latest on-dit from London, and Eleanor navigated each topic with careful grace, drawing out Lady Bentley on the subject of her gardens, and engaging Sir Frederick in a discussion of the hunting season that revealed she knew rather more about estate management than they had expected, and she was just beginning to feel that perhaps she might survive the evening unscathed, when Lady Hamilton set down her wine-glass with a delicate precision that somehow commanded the attention of the entire table. "How fortunate you are, Your Grace," Lady Hamilton said, her smile as sharp as cut glass, "to have risen so remarkably from such modest circumstances. One can only imagine what particular qualities recommended you so highly to our dear Duke, and the implication hung in the air like poison, the suggestion that Eleanor had employed arts other than her character to secure her position, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, even as she opened her mouth to respond with what dignity she could muster. But before she could speak, the Duke's voice cut through the silence with the cold precision of a blade. "I find myself curious, Lady Hamilton, whether you imagine my judgment so poor that I would choose a wife for any reason other than her exceptional intelligence, her grace under circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits, and her remarkable ability to improve everything she touches." And the table went utterly still, and Lady Hamilton's face flushed an unbecoming red as she murmured something about meaning no offence. And Eleanor stared at her plate because she could not trust herself to look at the man who had just defended her with such devastating efficiency. The remainder of dinner passed in subdued conversation, the other guests suddenly finding Eleanor's opinions fascinating and her observations worthy of genuine attention. and when they retired to the drawing-room for coffee and cards, she moved through her duties as hostess with a new confidence kindled by the warmth that had not left her chest since the Duke's words. Lord Hamilton had cornered Sir Frederick near the fire, and was holding forth on his recent acquisition of a particularly fine horse, his voice carrying across the room as he described in exhaustive detail every aspect of the animal's pedigree and the considerable sum he had paid for it. And Eleanor found herself standing near the Duke as they both watched the performance, and before she could stop herself she murmured, "I believe Lord Hamilton has confused dinner conversation with an auction catalogue, though I confess I cannot determine whether he is selling the horse or himself." And the sound that escaped the Duke was so unexpected that it took her a moment to recognize it as laughter, a real laugh that transformed his stern features into something approaching boyish delight, and several guests turned to stare, because apparently the Duke of Ashford laughing was remarkable enough to warrant open astonishment. "I did not know you could laugh, Your Grace," Eleanor whispered, her heart beating wildly against her ribs, and he looked down at her with eyes that had warmed to amber in the candlelight, and when he spoke his voice was low and rough, and meant only for her. Neither did I. The week that followed the dinner party unfolded with a gentleness Eleanor had not expected, each day bringing small moments that accumulated like petals falling one by one until she found herself surrounded by something she had not dared to name. And it was on an afternoon when the spring sunshine had coaxed the gardens into their fullest splendour that she walked the winding paths with Mrs. Thornton at her side, ostensibly discussing the household accounts, but in truth simply savouring the warmth and the scent of growing things, and the peculiar contentment that had settled into her bones since that evening when the Duke had laughed and looked at her as though she were something precious. The gardens at Ashford Hall were magnificent, a testament to generations of careful cultivation, and Eleanor paused before a bed of roses that blazed crimson in the afternoon light. But her gaze drifted past them to a corner where only greenery grew, and without thinking she said, "My mother grew white camellias in our garden at Briarwood. They were her pride, and she would spend hours tending them. I have always thought them the most beautiful of flowers, though I know roses are more fashionable." And Mrs. Thornton made a small sound of acknowledgment, and the conversation moved on to other matters, and Eleanor thought nothing more of it, for it had been merely idle reminiscence, the kind of thing one says when walking in a garden and thinking of home. 3 days later, she returned to her private sitting-room after a morning spent reviewing correspondence with the estate steward, her mind occupied with drainage improvements and tenant concerns, and when she opened the door she stopped so abruptly that her hand flew to her throat. In that gesture she could not seem to control, for the room had been transformed into something from a dream, every surface covered with vases of white camellias, dozens upon dozens of them, their waxy petals gleaming like moonlight made solid, and their fragrance rising to meet her in a wave so sweet and so achingly familiar that tears sprang to her eyes before she could prevent them. She stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, her gaze travelling from the mantelpiece where 3 crystal vases held cascading blooms to the small table by the window, where more flowers clustered like gathered clouds to her writing desk, where a single perfect camellia lay across her correspondence as though placed there by a careful hand, and when she finally turned to look at Mrs. Thornton, who had appeared silently behind her, she saw that the housekeeper's eyes were suspiciously bright, her stern face softened by something that looked very much like hope. "He left no note," Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and Mrs. Thornton shook her head, her lips pressed together as though holding back words she did not trust herself to speak. And Eleanor understood then that the Duke had given instructions and departed, that he had not waited to see her reaction, that he had offered this gift without expectation of thanks or acknowledgement, and something cracked open in her chest, something she had kept carefully sealed since that night, 3 years ago, when she had learned that hope was a cruelty. At dinner that evening, She sat across from him in the candle-lit dining room, the scent of camellias still clinging to her skin from the hours she had spent simply sitting among them and breathing. And when the servants had withdrawn, and they were alone with their wine, and the silence that had grown somehow less uncomfortable between them, she said quietly, "Thank you for the flowers." And he nodded once, a curt acknowledgment, as though filling her private sitting room with her favourite blooms was a matter of no consequence, as though he had not somehow procured dozens of white camellias that were not even in season, and arranged them in every corner of her sanctuary. "How did you know?" she pressed, unable to let it rest, unable to pretend that this was ordinary. And he was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening in that way she had come to recognize as a sign of emotion he could not express. And then he said simply, "You mentioned it." I listened, and his dark eyes met hers across the table, and she saw something vulnerable there, something almost frightened, as though he had revealed more than he intended. And then he looked away toward the window where the last light of evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Eleanor touched the hollow of her throat and felt her heart beating against her fingertips and thought, I promised myself I would not hope, but hope, it seemed, had found her anyway. Sleep eluded her that night, as it had so many nights before, though now the wakefulness carried a different quality, less the sharp-edged restlessness of grief, and more the soft ache of something unfurling in her chest that she did not yet dare to name. And when the clock in the hallway struck midnight, Eleanor abandoned her tangled sheets and reached for her wrapper, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards as she made her way through the darkened corridors toward the Beaune library where she had found solace so many times before, the scent of leather and old paper calling to her like a familiar voice. The fire had burned low, but still cast enough amber light to navigate by, and she did not bother to light a candle as she moved along the shelves, her fingers trailing across spines until they caught on a volume that seemed to lean toward her touch, a small book bound in leather, so worn it felt soft as cloth. And when she drew it from its place, she saw that it was a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, the gold lettering on the cover nearly rubbed away by what must have been countless hands holding it over countless years. She settled into the corner of the settee nearest the dying fire, and opened the book carefully, reverently, and her breath caught when she saw the marginalia, the delicate handwriting in faded ink that annotated certain passages, underlined particular phrases, left small notes in a feminine script that spoke of someone who had loved these words deeply. And she turned the pages slowly until she reached Sonnet 116, and found it more heavily marked than any other, the lines about love that is not love, which alters when it alteration finds underscored twice. A small heart drawn in the margin with an ink that had faded to the colour of old roses. She was so absorbed in tracing those faded marks with her fingertip that she did not hear him enter until his voice came from the doorway, low and rough with something she could not identify. You found her book, and Eleanor startled so violently that she nearly dropped the precious volume, her hand flying to her throat as she looked up to find the Duke standing at the threshold in his shirt-sleeves, his cravat gone and his dark hair disordered, as though he too had been wrestling with sleeplessness, and his eyes when they met hers were not cold at all, but rather filled with something raw and unguarded that made her chest ache. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, rising as if to return the book to its shelf. "I did not mean to intrude upon something private. I did not know." But he crossed the room before she could move further, and his hand closed gently over hers, where she clutched the worn leather, stilling her, and he said, "No." And then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, "Sit, please." And so she did, and after a moment he lowered himself onto the settee beside her, closer than propriety would normally allow, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and cedar, and something underneath that was simply him. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough as gravel, and Eleanor held very still, because she understood instinctively that this moment was fragile as spun glass, that any wrong word might shatter whatever had compelled him to speak. She read it constantly, annotated every page. She used to read the sonnets aloud to me when I was a boy and could not sleep. Her voice was, and he stopped, his jaw tightening, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than on her, and Eleanor waited, barely breathing, as the silence stretched between them like a held breath. "She died when I was 12, he continued finally, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "A fever that took her in 3 days. She was laughing with me at breakfast, and by week's end she was gone. And my father, he could not bear it. He looked at me and saw her, and so he stopped looking at me at all." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not let them fall, because this was not her grief to claim. This was his, offered up like a gift he did not know how to give. "He taught me that love was weakness," the Duke said, "that to care for someone was to hand them the power to destroy you. His dying words to me were a command to marry strategically, to never make his mistake, to never let anyone close enough to leave that kind of wound." And Eleanor understood then, understood the coldness and the distance and the walls he had built so high around himself, understood that every moment of unexpected tenderness had been a crack in armour he had worn for 20 years. She did not offer platitudes about time healing, or his mother watching from heaven, or any of the hollow comforts people pressed upon the grieving. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for trusting me with her memory," and she watched something shift in his face, something that looked almost like wonder, and when his hand moved across the small space between them on the settee, his fingers coming to rest a hair's breadth from her own, she did not pull away, and neither did he. The month that had passed since that night in the library had transformed something fundamental between them, a shift as subtle and inexorable as the turning of seasons, and now, as their carriage rolled through the lamplit streets of London toward the Kensington ball, Eleanor sat across from her husband in a gown of midnight blue silk that Mrs. Thornton had insisted brought out the grey-green of her eyes, and she tried to steady the trembling in her hands by pressing them flat against her skirts, while the Duke watched her with those dark eyes that had learned to warm for her alone. Though tonight even his steady presence could not quiet the anxiety that coiled in her stomach like a living thing. This was their first major society event as a married couple, the first time she would face the assembled ton, not as the penniless Ashworth girl who had been so publicly humiliated, but as the Duchess of Ashford, and she knew with the certainty of long experience that every eye would be upon her, every whisper would dissect her gown and her jewels, and the way her husband looked at her or failed to look at her, and the verdict of this single evening would follow her for years to come. The ballroom, when they entered, was a blaze of candlelight and crystal, hundreds of tapers reflected in mirrors that lined the walls until the room seemed to contain 1,000 flames, and the music of the orchestra swelled, beneath the hum of conversation and the rustle of silk and the clink of champagne glasses, and Eleanor felt the weight of attention settle upon her like a physical thing as heads turned and fans fluttered, and she heard her new title ripple through the crowd in murmurs that she could not quite decipher. The Duke's hand rested at the small of her back, warm and steady through the fabric of her gown, and she drew strength from that touch as they made their way through the crush of bodies, nodding to acquaintances and accepting congratulations that ranged from genuine to barely concealed curiosity. And she held her shoulders straight and her chin high, and told herself that she belonged here, that she had every right to stand at this man's side, even as a treacherous voice whispered that she was still the same girl who had hidden behind a pillar and listened to her heart shatter. She saw him before she was prepared, Theodore Blackwell, standing near the refreshment table, with a glass of champagne in his soft, manicured hand, and the sight of him struck her like a blow to the chest, though he looked diminished somehow, thinner than she remembered, his golden hair less lustrous, and his charming smile strained at the edges as though it cost him effort to maintain, and beside him stood his wife Harriet, with her mouth pressed into a bitter line, and her eyes fixed on some middle distance, as though she could not bear to look at the man she had married, for his title and his promises. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat before she could stop it, her fingertips pressing against her pulse, and she forced herself to look away, to focus on the music and the swirl of dancers and the solid warmth of Henry beside her. But her heart was pounding with a complex alchemy of old pain and new satisfaction, and something that felt almost like pity for the woman who had won the prize Eleanor had once thought she wanted. A gentleman approached to speak with the Duke about some parliamentary matter, drawing Henry a few steps away with an apologetic glance toward Eleanor, and she nodded her permission and turned to study a nearby floral arrangement with an intensity it did not deserve, counting the roses to calm herself, and she did not hear Theodore approach until his voice slithered into her ear like poison wrapped in silk. "My dear Miss Ashworth, or I suppose I must say your grace now, what a remarkable rise you have achieved," and when she turned to face him, his blue eyes held the same cold amusement she remembered from that terrible night 3 years ago, the same certainty that she was beneath him, a plaything to be discarded. "I must confess myself curious," he continued, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "What arts did you employ to catch a duke when you could not even hold the attention of a mere viscount?" And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the old wound ripped open, fresh and bleeding as though no time had passed at all, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her throat closed around the humiliation that flooded back with all its original force. Theodore smiled, that charming smile that never reached his eyes, and leaned closer until she could smell the wine on his breath. "Enjoy it while it lasts, my dear. Men like Ashford do not keep plain little things like you for long." And Eleanor stood frozen, her hand pressed to her throat, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but feel the ground crumbling beneath her feet as the ballroom spun with candlelight and whispers, and the cruel certainty that she would never truly escape what she had been. The Duke returned to her side in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and Eleanor watched his face transform as he took in the scene before him. Her pallor and her trembling hand pressed to her throat, and Theodore's smirking satisfaction, and she saw the precise moment when understanding struck him, because his dark eyes went from warm amber to something ancient and terrible, a cold so absolute it seemed to freeze the very air around them. And Theodore must have seen it too, because his smirk faltered for just an instant before he attempted to recover his composure with a languid sip of champagne that fooled no one. Henry did not ask what had happened, did not spare Eleanor a questioning glance, did not do any of the things a lesser man might have done to assess the situation before acting. He simply stepped forward until he stood between Eleanor and Theodore like a wall of ice and stone, and when he spoke his voice carried across the nearby guests with the quiet authority of a man who had never in his life needed to raise his voice to command attention. "I find myself curious." "Blackwell," he said, and the use of the surname without title was a cut as precise as a surgeon's blade, whether your tongue has always been so loose, or whether it is merely the desperation of a man whose investments have failed so spectacularly that half of London whispers about his debts. And Eleanor heard the collective intake of breath from the guests who had drifted closer, drawn by the unmistakable scent of social blood in the water. Theodore's face went white, then red, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Henry continued as though he had not noticed, his tone almost conversational in its devastating calm. "I have heard it said that Lady Blackwell has not smiled in public since 3 months after your wedding, a remarkable achievement for a man who once prided himself on his charm, though I suppose charm is rather less effective when one's creditors come calling, and one's wife discovers that the fortune she married has evaporated like morning mist. And the silence that had fallen over this corner of the ballroom was spreading now, rippling outward as more and more guests turned to watch the Duke of Ashford systematically dismantle a man with nothing but words and winter in his eyes. "You were not worthy to speak her name then." "Blackwell," Henry said, and his voice dropped to something that was almost soft, almost gentle, which made it somehow more terrifying. "You were not worthy when you amused yourself with her affections and discarded her like yesterday's newspaper, and you are certainly not worthy now. My wife is the Duchess of Ashford, and you will address her with the respect her station demands, or you will not address her at all." And the final words fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the distant strains of the orchestra in the next room, could hear her own heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Theodore stood frozen, his champagne glass trembling in his soft hand, and then without a word he turned and retreated into the crowd, his wife following at a distance with an expression that might have been satisfaction, and Eleanor watched him go, and felt something loosen in her chest, some knot that had been tied there for 3 long years, finally coming undone. Henry turned to her then, and his eyes were warm again, warm amber that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and he offered his arm with a formality that was somehow tender. "Shall we dance, Your Grace?" he said quietly, for her ears alone, and Eleanor placed her trembling hand on his steady arm and let him lead her toward the dance floor as the music swelled and the whispers began, and she realized that she was shaking, not from fear or humiliation, but from the overwhelming force of being so completely, so publicly, so fiercely defended. And as he drew her into his arms, and they began to move together through the steps of the waltz, she looked up into his face and thought with a clarity that left no room for doubt, "I am in love with him." The carriage wheels rattled against the cobblestones as they made their way through the lamplit streets toward the townhouse, and Eleanor sat in the velvet darkness with her husband across from her, his presence filling the small space with the scent of sandalwood and cedar that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. And she could not stop trembling, could not seem to gather the scattered pieces of herself into anything resembling composure, because what had happened in that ballroom had shattered something inside her and rebuilt it in a shape she did not yet recognize. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "for what you did, for defending me." And she watched his face in the flickering light that filtered through the carriage windows, watched the way his jaw tightened and his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as though he could not bear to meet her gaze. "No one speaks to my wife that way," he said, and his voice was rough, almost harsh, dismissing her gratitude as though it were an unnecessary thing, as though what he had done required no acknowledgement, because it was simply what was done, what would always be done. And Eleanor felt her heart clench at the fierce protectiveness beneath his clipped words. The silence stretched between them, filled with the rattle of wheels and the distant sounds of London at night. And Eleanor knew with sudden clarity that she could not let this moment pass without telling him the truth, the whole truth, the shameful secret she had carried for 3 years like a stone against her heart. "I must tell you something," she said, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers twisting together as though they could anchor her against the tide of memory that threatened to sweep her away. "I must tell you what happened, what he did, why I was so—" And she could not finish the sentence, could not find the words for what she had been when Theodore approached her with his poisoned smile. Henry said nothing, only watched her with those dark eyes that had learned to warm for her alone, and his silence was not cold, but patient, waiting, giving her the space to find her way through the thorns of the past. "3 years ago," she began, and her voice trembled but did not break. "At the Hartwell spring ball, Theodore Blackwell had been courting me for months, I believed. I thought he meant to propose. I was foolish enough to hope. And she told him everything then, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam, the overheard conversation and the cruel laughter, and the way Theodore had shrugged when he saw her stricken face, the whispers that followed her for seasons afterward, the shame that had taught her to expect nothing, so that she could never be shattered again. When she finished, the carriage was silent, save for the creaking of springs and the steady rhythm of hooves on stone, and Eleanor waited for disgust or pity or the careful distance of a man who had learned he had married damaged goods. But Henry's jaw was tight and his hands were clenched on his thighs, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, with something that sounded almost like rage, held barely in check. "He was a fool," Henry said, and the words were simple, but they fell into the darkness between them like stones into still water. And then, after a pause so long, Eleanor thought he might not speak again. "I am not skilled at words, Eleanor. I have never been skilled at words. They do not come easily to me the way they seem to come to other men. But I would have you know." And he stopped, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, as though the words he sought might be written there in the lamplight. "I did not choose you because you were convenient. I chose you because you were remarkable." And Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs, and she wanted to tell him, wanted to say the words that burned in her throat. "I love you. I love you. I love you." But they would not come. They stuck behind her teeth like thorns. And so she sat in the velvet darkness, with her hands clasped tight and her heart laid bare, and the aching uncertainty of loving a man who might never be able to say the words she longed to hear. The week since their return from London had passed in a strange twilight of almost and not quite, of glances that lingered a heartbeat too long, and hands that brushed in passing with an electricity that left Eleanor breathless, and she found herself watching her husband with a hunger she could no longer pretend was anything other than what it was: love, desperate and consuming, and entirely unwelcome in its intensity, because Henry had become more guarded since that night in the carriage, more careful, as though the words he had spoken in the darkness had cost him something he was not yet ready to pay again. And Eleanor did not know how to bridge the distance that seemed to grow even as the air between them crackled with unspoken things. She walked the grounds of Ashford Hall in the late afternoon light, the gardens heavy with the scent of roses in full bloom and the green growing things of early summer, and she tried to untangle the knot of longing and frustration that had taken up permanent residence in her chest, because she loved him. She loved him with a ferocity that frightened her, and she was almost certain he felt something for her too. She had seen it in his eyes when he defended her at the ball, had heard it in the roughness of his voice when he called her remarkable. But his walls were so high and so thick, and she did not know how to scale them, did not know if he would ever let her in, or if she would spend the rest of her life pressing her hands against cold stone and hoping for a door that might never open. She paused beside a bush of white camellias, their petals luminous in the golden light, and she touched one bloom with trembling fingers, remembering the morning she had found her sitting room filled with them, remembering his simple words. "You mentioned it. I listened," and she thought of the promise she had made to herself on the day she arrived at this house, the promise not to hope for more, not to be foolish enough to want what could not be given. And she realized with a hollow ache that she had broken that promise utterly, had shattered it beyond all repair, because she wanted everything now, wanted his heart and his trust and his love, wanted to hear him say the words she longed to say to him. "Your Grace!" came a voice from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Thornton approaching along the garden path, her sharp eyes softened by something that might have been sympathy. "I thought I might find you here," and the housekeeper came to stand beside her, both of them looking out over the roses and the rolling green of the estate beyond. "He has not been the same since you returned from London," Mrs. Thornton said quietly, and Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest. "He paces at night. I hear him in the halls when the house is sleeping, and he has asked me, more than once, about your preferences, your happiness, whether you have everything you need." And she turned to look at Eleanor with eyes that had watched Henry grow from a grieving boy into a frozen man. "He is fighting himself, your grace. He does not know how to surrender." And Eleanor stood in the garden with the scent of camellias surrounding her, and hope blooming treacherous and wild in her chest, despite every promise she had made to keep it contained. The portrait gallery stretched before her in the quiet of a grey afternoon, the light filtering through tall windows to illuminate the faces of Wentworths long dead, and Eleanor walked slowly past generations of dukes and duchesses and their children, past stern men in powdered wigs and women in elaborate gowns that spoke of centuries of wealth and consequence, until she found herself standing before a portrait that stopped her breath in her throat and held her rooted to the polished floor, as though she had grown there like one of the ancient oaks in the park beyond. The woman in the painting was beautiful in the way that mattered, not the cold perfection of classical features, but a warmth that seemed to glow from the canvas itself, dark eyes that held both intelligence and tenderness, a mouth curved in a smile that suggested she had been laughing at something just before the artist captured her likeness. And Eleanor recognized those eyes, recognized the strong line of the jaw and the way the woman held herself with quiet dignity, because she saw echoes of Henry in every brushstroke, saw the mother who had died when he was 12 and left him to grow cold in a house that had forgotten how to love. The Duchess wore a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the warmth in her complexion, her dark hair arranged in the fashion of 2 decades past, and her hands were folded gracefully before her, and on one of those painted hands there glinted a ring that made Eleanor's heart stutter and stop, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds set in gold that even in oil and pigment seemed to glow with the warmth of long wearing, and Eleanor looked down at her own hand with a shock that sent tremors through her entire body, because there on her finger sat the same ring, the sapphire deep as a midnight sea, and the diamonds catching the grey afternoon light, and the gold worn soft with age, in a way she had noticed but never questioned. And she understood now with devastating clarity what Henry had given her without explanation, what he had placed on her finger as though it were merely a pretty thing and not a piece of his heart that had been locked away for 20 years. She found him in his study as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening, found him bent over correspondence with his dark hair falling across his forehead and his jaw set in concentration, and when he looked up at her entrance, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been hope or fear or both tangled together beyond separation. And Eleanor stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her chest where the ring caught the lamplight, and asked in a voice that trembled, despite her best efforts to hold it, "Steady, the ring you gave me, who gave it to you?" And she watched his face transform, watched the careful blankness descend like a shield before his jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the window where rain had begun to fall against the glass. "It was my mother's," he said finally, and his voice was rough, as though the words had to be dragged from somewhere deep and guarded. "She wore it every day of her marriage, every single day until the day she died, and it has been in the vault since then because I could not bear to see it on anyone else's hand." And he stopped, his throat working, his eyes still fixed on the rain. "But I wanted you to have it, Eleanor. I wanted." And he could not finish, could not find the words. But Eleanor did not need them because she understood now what he had been telling her all along in the language of actions rather than words. And her hand trembled as she touched the sapphire that had once rested against the skin of the woman who had taught him what love looked like, before she left him alone in a world that had grown cold without her. The storm broke over Ashford Hall with a violence that matched the tempest in Eleanor's heart as she made her way through the darkening corridors toward the library, her slippers silent on the carpets, and her pulse thundering in her ears louder than the rain that lashed against the windows. and she knew she would find him there because it was where he always went, when the world pressed too close, where he had been that first night when thunder had startled her, and his hand had steadied her elbow, and everything had begun to shift beneath her feet, like sand giving way to tide. And when she reached the doorway, she saw him standing before the fire with his back to her, his broad shoulders rigid with tension, and his head bowed as though he carried a weight too heavy to bear alone. And the firelight caught the spines of books on the shelves, and illuminated the worn volume of sonnets that sat where it always sat, waiting. And Eleanor drew a breath that felt like courage, and stepped into the room and said his name, Henry, and he turned to face her with eyes that were dark and guarded and full of something that looked like fear. "I know what the ring means," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect, given the way her heart was throwing itself against her ribs. "I know it was your mother's. I know it has been locked away for 20 years. I know what it cost you to give it to me." And Henry's jaw tightened in that way she had come to know so well, the way that meant he was fighting something inside himself, and he looked away toward the window where lightning split the sky, and said in a voice gone cold and distant, "It is merely a ring. Eleanor, you should not read more into it than was intended." But she would not let him retreat, would not let him build his walls again when she had finally found the courage to scale them. And she crossed the room until she stood before him, close enough to smell the sandalwood and cedar that had become the scent of safety, close enough to see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. And she said, "I love you," the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. "I did not expect to. I did not want to. I promised myself I would not hope for more than contentment. But I love you, Henry. I love you with everything I am, and I cannot pretend otherwise for another moment." The silence stretched between them, filled only with the crack of thunder and the hiss of rain and the desperate beating of her heart. And then something broke in his face, some final barrier crumbling, and when he spoke his voice was rough and halting as though the words had to be dragged from the deepest part of him. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds," he said, and she recognized the words from his mother's book, from the sonnet underlined in faded ink, or Ben's with the remover to remove. And he stepped closer until barely a breath separated them. "I have loved you since this room, Eleanor, since the storm, since you looked at me without fear, and spoke to me as though I were a man and not a title. I have loved you in silence because I did not know how to do otherwise, because I was taught that love destroys, and I was afraid," and his voice cracked on the word. "I told you I would never give you cause to regret this arrangement. I told you that you would want for nothing, but I failed to anticipate that I would be the one with regrets. The regret of every moment I did not tell you that you are everything I never knew I wanted, everything I never dared to hope I could have." And then his hands, those large, gentle hands that had steadied her in this very room on a night just like this one, rose to cup her face with a tenderness that undid her completely, and Eleanor looked up into eyes that had warmed from darkness to amber, and felt tears spill down her cheeks as the storm raged beyond the windows. And peace finally settled into her heart. The kiss, when it came, was everything and nothing like Eleanor had imagined in the secret hours of the night when she had allowed herself to dream, despite her promises. For it began with a tenderness that made her weep anew, his lips brushing hers as though she were something precious and breakable, as though he feared she might shatter or vanish if he pressed too hard. But then her hands fisted in the fabric of his coat, and she pulled him closer with a desperation that surprised them both. And the kiss deepened into something that burned away every wall she had ever built, every guard she had ever maintained, until there was nothing left but the two of them, and the storm that raged beyond the windows and the fire that crackled in the hearth. And when he finally pulled back, his breathing was ragged, and his eyes were dark with wanting, and he asked in a voice gone rough as gravel, "Are you certain, Eleanor? Are you certain this is what you want? Because I will not be able to let you go. If you give yourself to me, I will not be able to pretend this was merely an arrangement." And she answered not with words, but by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his again, by sliding her hands beneath his coat to feel the warmth of him through the fine linen of his shirt. And he made a sound low in his throat that was half groan and half prayer, before he swept her into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all, and carried her through the darkened corridors of Ashford Hall to his chambers, to the room she had never entered, to the bed where he laid her down, with a reverence that made her heart ache with the beauty of being so completely wanted. The storm began to quiet as they came together, the thunder growing distant and the rain softening from violence to whisper, and Eleanor discovered that the breaking down of final barriers was not a surrender, but a homecoming, not a loss of self, but a finding of something she had not known she was missing. And his hands were gentle, even in their urgency, and his voice was rough with emotion, as he spoke her name again and again, like an incantation, like a vow, like a man who had been drowning and had finally found shore. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of sandalwood and cedar, and the salt of mingled tears, his arms wrapped around her and his lips pressed to her hair, Eleanor thought of the woman she had been on that grey morning at Briarwood Manor, the woman who had learned that hope was a cruelty, and she understood now how wrong she had been. "I promised myself I would not hope," she thought, as his chest rose and fell beneath her cheek, and his heartbeat drummed steady and sure against her ear. I was wrong. Hope found me anyway, and Henry spoke her name one final time, just her name, Eleanor, spoken as though it were a prayer, as though it were the only word that mattered in any language ever spoken, and she had never in all her life felt so completely and utterly loved. The morning light that filtered through the curtains of Henry's chambers was soft and golden, nothing like the grey dawn that had once crept through the thin drapes of her room at Briarwood Manor, and Eleanor lay in the circle of her husband's arms, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeams, and marvelling at how completely the world had transformed between one heartbeat and the next, how the man, who had seemed so cold and forbidding, now pressed sleepy kisses to her shoulder, and murmured her name against her skin, as though he could not bear to let a moment pass without speaking it. And when they finally descended to breakfast, it was with hands that found each other beneath the table, and glances that held entire conversations and smiles that neither of them seemed capable of suppressing, and Mrs. Thornton, who had served Ashford Hall for 30 years, and had watched the young master grow from a laughing boy into a frozen man, stopped in the doorway with the morning post, and stood perfectly still as she observed the Duke lean close to whisper something that made the Duchess laugh, a real laugh, bright and unself-conscious, and the housekeeper's eyes filled with tears, that she quickly blinked away before approaching Eleanor later that morning in the rose garden, where the Duchess had gone to cut flowers for the breakfast-room. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. She did not try to hide. His Grace has not smiled like that since before his mother passed. God rest her soul. You have done something 20 years of society matchmaking could not accomplish. And Eleanor remembered the prediction she had overheard on her first day at Ashford Hall, the words that had seemed more warning than welcome, and she understood now that Mrs. Thornton had been hoping all along, hoping that someone would finally reach the boy she had helped raise. And Eleanor took the older woman's weathered hand in her own and said simply, "He healed me too." The weeks that followed passed in a haze of happiness so complete that Eleanor sometimes had to touch the sapphire ring on her finger to convince herself she was not dreaming. And when the invitation arrived for the Hartwell summer ball, she felt none of the dread that had once accompanied any mention of that name, only a quiet certainty that she was ready to return to the place where everything had shattered and show the world how beautifully the pieces had been remade. And Henry must have sensed her thoughts, because he came to stand behind her as she read the invitation, and wrapped his arms around her waist, and pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, and asked if she wished to attend. And she turned in his embrace, and looked up into eyes that had once seemed cold as winter stone, but now burned warm as amber honey, and said, "Yes, I believe I do." The Hartwell ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the night of the summer ball. The same chandeliers that had illuminated her humiliation now casting their golden glow upon Eleanor as she entered on her husband's arm, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that matched the sapphire at her finger, and she was aware of the whispers that followed their progress through the crowd. But they were different whispers now, admiring rather than pitying, envious rather than mocking. And her parents stood near the refreshment table, beaming with a pride that made her heart swell, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and her father standing straighter than he had in years. And when Eleanor approached them, Lady Margaret Ashworth cupped her daughter's face in her hands and said, "I always knew, my darling, I always knew the right man would see you clearly." And Lord Charles Ashworth shook the Duke's hand with a grip that conveyed everything words could not express. Henry rarely left her side throughout the evening, his hand resting at the small of her back, in a gesture that was both proprietary and tender. And when they danced, he held her closer than was strictly proper, and looked at her as though she were the only person in the room, and Eleanor saw the other guests watching them with expressions that ranged from surprise to speculation to something that looked almost like hope, as though the sight of the cold Duke of Ashford, so obviously besotted with his wife, gave them permission to believe in love themselves. And it was during the second waltz that Eleanor's gaze drifted across the ballroom, and found Theodore Blackwell standing alone near a pillar, his golden hair dulled, and his handsome face grown thin and lined with discontent, his wife Harriet visible across the room, pointedly refusing to look in his direction. And Eleanor remembered the man who had once made her feel so small and worthless, and found that she felt nothing but a distant, almost gentle pity, for he had everything he had schemed for, and none of what mattered, while she had stumbled into an arrangement of convenience and found the great love of her life. And when Theodore's eyes met hers across the crowded ballroom, he was the one who looked away first, unable to hold her gaze, and Eleanor turned back to her husband and smiled up at him with a joy so complete it seemed to illuminate her from within, and Henry smiled back at her with that rare, transformative smile that Mrs. Thornton said she had not seen in 20 years, and Eleanor knew that the girl who had once hidden behind a pillar in this very room, listening to her heart break, had finally, completely, come home. 5 years had passed since the storm that changed everything. 5 years of mornings waking in Henry's arms, and evenings reading by the fire, and nights filled with whispered conversations and tender touches. And now Eleanor walked through the Ashford gardens on a summer afternoon that smelled of roses and fresh rain. The storm that had swept through that morning having left the world washed clean and glistening, droplets still clinging to petals and leaves like scattered diamonds, and her hand rested on the swell of her belly, where their third child grew, while ahead of her on the gravel path, their son William, 4 years old, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's chestnut hair, chased after his sister Charlotte, barely 2, and toddling on unsteady legs that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, their nurse walking patiently behind them as their laughter rang out across the gardens like bells. And Eleanor thought of how silent these grounds had once seemed, how the grandeur of Ashford Hall had felt more like a mausoleum than a home, and she marvelled at the transformation that love had wrought, at the way joy had seeped into every corner of this great house until it fairly hummed with life. And then she heard footsteps on the path behind her, and turned to find Henry approaching with that smile that still made her heart flutter, even after all these years. The smile that Mrs. Thornton said she had not seen since before his mother's passing, and he came to stand beside her, and his hand found hers as naturally as breathing. their fingers intertwining in a gesture so familiar it felt like coming home. And together they watched their children play in the garden, where white camellias bloomed in profusion, the flowers he had first given her without explanation all those years ago, now spreading throughout the grounds as though love itself had taken root and flourished. That evening her parents sat in the drawing-room, while William demonstrated his letters, and Charlotte climbed into her grandfather's lap demanding a story, and Lord Charles Ashworth, who had once worried so desperately about his daughter's future, now beamed with a contentment that smoothed the lines from his weathered face, and Lady Margaret caught Eleanor's eye across the room and smiled with tears glistening. And Mrs. Thornton paused in the doorway, watching the scene with an expression of such profound satisfaction that Eleanor had to look away lest she weep herself. And later still, when the children had been tucked into their beds, and her parents had retired, and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet of a summer evening, Eleanor and Henry found their way to the library, as they so often did, to the room where a storm had once trapped them together and changed the course of both their lives. And she settled into the settee with the worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets in her hands, the same book with its faded annotations that had belonged to his mother. And she read aloud while he watched her, with eyes that glowed warm amber in the firelight. And when she finished Sonnet 116, he reached over and took her hand and raised it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm that made her shiver even now. And he said quietly, "I believe I fell in love with you in this room." And Eleanor smiled and replied, "I know. I fell in love with you in this room too." And she thought of the woman she had been 5 years ago, wounded and guarded, and so certain that hope was a cruelty, and she rested her free hand on her belly, where new life stirred, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was always meant to be. The portrait gallery lay quiet in the amber glow of evening when Eleanor slipped away from the library and made her way through the corridors she now knew as intimately as the chambers of her own heart, her slippers whispering against the polished floors as she passed through pools of candlelight and shadow, until she stood at last before the painting that had haunted her thoughts since the day she first discovered the truth of the sapphire ring upon her finger. And there, in the gilt frame, the previous Duchess of Ashford gazed down at her with dark eyes so like Henry's that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, as it always did. Eyes that held warmth and wisdom, and a love so profound it had reached across 20 years of silence to touch a wounded girl who had stumbled into this great house expecting nothing and found everything, and Eleanor raised her hand to touch the ring that had once graced the elegant fingers captured in oil and pigment, the sapphire cool against her skin, the gold worn soft with the weight of 2 women's devotion. And she thought of all the things she wished she could say to this woman she had never known, how she would thank her for raising a son capable of such fierce and tender love, how she would promise to honor the legacy of warmth and grace that had been so cruelly interrupted, how she would tell her that the boy who had frozen his heart against loss had learned at last to love again, and she was so lost in contemplation that she did not hear Henry's footsteps until he stood beside her, his presence as familiar now as her own heartbeat, his scent of sandalwood and cedar wrapping around her like an embrace. And when she looked up at him, his eyes were bright with an emotion that still stole her breath, even after 5 years of marriage and 2 children, and a third stirring beneath her heart. And he said quietly, "I have commissioned a portrait," and Eleanor blinked in confusion until he continued, "Of you, to hang beside hers, because you are the Duchess now. You are the heart of this house. You always will be." And the tears came then, unstoppable, streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of what he offered settled into her soul. Not merely a place on the wall, but a place in the unbroken chain of love that stretched backward through generations and forward into the future their children would inherit. And Henry gathered her into his arms and held her while she wept, his hand stroking her hair, his lips pressing kisses to her temple, and Eleanor thought of the girl she had been on that grey morning at Briarwood Manor, when she had believed that hope was a cruelty, when she had armoured herself against wanting what she was certain she could never have, and she marvelled at how wrong she had been, how the greatest gifts often came wrapped in the most unexpected packages, how a marriage of convenience had become a love story for the ages, how a man who could not speak of feelings had learned to show them in 1,000 daily acts of devotion, and she understood now what she wished she could tell every wounded heart still waiting in the shadows, that love is not the lightning strike of first passion, but the steady flame that burns brighter with each passing year, that it is found not in grand declarations, but in remembered flowers and inherited rings, and the courage to be truly seen, that it asks only that we remain open to its possibility, even when every experience has taught us to guard ourselves against its power. And as Eleanor stood in her husband's arms beneath the portrait of the woman whose ring she wore and whose son she cherished, she sent a silent prayer of gratitude into the universe, for storms that trap strangers in libraries, and for proposals that seem purely practical, and for the miraculous alchemy that transforms arrangement into devotion. And if you, who have journeyed with her through heartbreak and healing, have found in this story even a glimmer of the hope that carried Eleanor from despair to joy, then know that such love exists for you as well, waiting perhaps in the most unlikely of places, asking only that you believe yourself worthy of being chosen, for you are, dear listener, you are.